On the 4th of July, 1187, the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ceased to exist. In a single afternoon, on a dry hill called Hattin, the state built by 3 generations of Crusaders was scraped off the map. The city stood empty of defenders. The castles held only skeleton garrisons. The ports lay open. Saladin did not need to storm them. He walked in. For 800 years, this battle has worn the crown of blame, the day the kingdom died. But Hattin was not the wound. It was the scar tissue over a wound that had been bleeding for 90 years. The machine that lost that battle had been grinding through one resource the kingdom could never replace: its own kings. Look at the enemy's chroniclers, and even they struggled to explain it. Saladin's own secretary, Imad ad-Din, wrote of a Frankish court that seemed to hollow itself out from within, quarreling while the noose tightened. He was not wrong. Of the 20-odd men and women who held the title to Jerusalem, not one died peacefully in the capital with a grown heir waiting at the door. Their reigns ended in ways that read like a curse. One king watched leprosy take his face and his hands before it took his life. One fell from a palace window. One died after eating bad fish following a siege on the coast. One was thrown from his horse and crushed beneath his own saddle. One was cut down in the street by killers dressed as monks, days after the crown touched his head. The last of the line was marched into a market square in Naples, 1,000 miles from the city, he claimed, and beheaded before a crowd. This is not a chronicle of bad luck. It is the anatomy of a system, a crown engineered with a flaw buried in its foundation, a machine that was built to consume the men who wore it. Every death opened a crisis. Every child heir opened a regency, and every regency was an open invitation to civil war. When a king died without a son, the great barons did not gather to save the kingdom. They gathered to raise their own houses higher. The threat beyond the walls never stopped. Saladin was real, patient, and closing in. But the deeper rot was structural, written into the shape of the crown itself. So to understand why Jerusalem fell, we will not stand on the hill at Hattin. We will stand at the graves. We will read the obituaries of its kings, one funeral at a time, and watch a countdown that no one at court could see running out. Let us know which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. We read every single one. If you value this kind of deep historical investigation, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. 87 years before the army bled out at Hattin, the clock started. The year is 1100, inside Jerusalem, taken 12 months earlier in a storm of slaughter that the men who did it would boast about in letters carried back to France. The victorious lords are standing over a fresh problem. Their leader is dead. Godfrey of Bouillon, the man whose troops had gone over the walls near the quadrangular tower on the 15th of July, 1099, had lasted barely a year. And in that year, he had done something no ruler of a besieged state can afford to do. He had refused to be a king. He would not wear a crown of gold, he said, in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took a title stitched together from piety and politics: Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a beautiful phrase. It was also a wound at the root of everything. By turning down the word king, Godfrey left this new thing they had built with no clear name for its own head of state, a narrow Christian foothold on a coastline of a few hundred miles, hemmed by Fatimid Egypt to the south and a ring of Turkish emirs to the north and east. and at the very moment of its birth, no agreed way to say who ruled it or how the ruling passed on. Here is the object at the center of this whole chronicle, the crown of Jerusalem. From the day it was first imagined, nobody was sure who had the right to wear it, or how long they got to keep it. That uncertainty is the crack. Everything that follows falls through it. Godfrey died in July of 1100, likely of typhoid, in the sweltering heat that hangs over the Judean hills in high summer. Some said an arrow at the siege of Acre. Most said fever. Before his body had cooled, a faction of clergy under the Patriarch Damber of Pisa tried to seize the whole city for the church, arguing the Holy Sepulchre belonged to God, not to any secular lord. It was the first grab. It would not be the last. The barons moved faster than the priests. They shut the gates of the Tower of David, that great stone block above the western wall, and sent hard riders north to fetch Godfrey's brother. They reached for Baldwin of Bouillon and got a man cut from opposite cloth. Baldwin had no scruples about gold. He had already carved out his own principality far to the north at Edessa, marrying an Armenian noblewoman and learning how a Latin lord survives among Eastern Christians and Muslim neighbors alike. He was a soldier and a builder of states, and he understood a simple thing his brother had missed. A frontier this thin needed a king, not a caretaker. He rode south with a small escort of 200 knights and 700 foot, beat off an ambush by the emir of Damascus in the narrow coastal pass at the Dog River near Beirut, and reached Jerusalem in November. He took the title Godfrey had refused on Christmas Day in the year 1100 in the Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem. He was crowned Baldwin I. For 18 years, he was exactly what the kingdom required. He never stopped moving. He marched his small columns up and down the coast and took the port cities one by one. Arsuf and Caesarea in 1101, Acre in 1104, Beirut and Sidon in 1110. The harbors mattered more than any inland victory because they were the mouths that let Italian ships bring European men, grain, and steel ashore. Genoese and Pisan fleets became partners in siege, their crossbowmen lining the decks, while their captains bargained for a third of the plunder and a quarter of every captured town. Whole streets and churches signed over in writing before a single wall was breached. Baldwin raised the first line of castles that would carry the kingdom's defense for the next century, squat stone keeps on the ridges above the roads. He drew the borders, wrote the feudal law, and welded a scatter of warlords and pilgrims into something that could function under permanent siege. He turned a massacre into a country, and the way he died set the template that every death after his would follow. In the spring of 1118, he was on campaign far to the south, deep in Egyptian ground near the eastern branch of the Nile, raiding toward the town of Farama. His men netted fish in the river and cooked them, and the king ate. That night, an old lance wound from a battle years before tore open again. The infection moved fast through his gut. There was no road home long enough. Miles from his own gates, in hostile country, the founder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was dying, and his men were left holding a problem with no dignified answer. How do you carry a king's body back across 150 miles of open desert in the rising heat of Palm Sunday season without it rotting on the way? Their solution was practical, and it was grim. The king's cook, a man named Addo, was brought to the tent. The man who had spent years preparing Baldwin's meals was set instead to preserving his body, packing the emptied cavity with salt and spice, and stitching it closed, so the flesh would survive the road. The first true king of Jerusalem came home, not at the front of a triumph, but carried across the sand, salted like provisions, to keep him whole until Jerusalem could bury him. His column reached the walls on Palm Sunday itself, and the crowds who had gathered by the Golden Gate with branches in their hands to greet Christ's entry wept instead at the sight of their dead king. They laid him beside Godfrey in the row of tombs beneath the hill of Golgotha. He left no children. The throne stood empty a second time. The crown went sideways to a cousin, another Baldwin, Lord of Edessa, who ruled as Baldwin II. His reign put the kingdom's deepest weakness on open display. There were never enough men. The Crusader states were starving for population. A knight in the West could be replaced by another. A knight who died in Palestine took years and a sea voyage to replace. And this king spent a large slice of his reign not on a throne, but in a cell. In 1123, campaigning in the north, he was taken alive by the Turkish emir Balak and dragged to the fortress of Karput, a fastness on a crag in what is now eastern Turkey. He was held over a year. When a band of Armenian raiders slipped into the castle in disguise and briefly freed him, Balak's men stormed back and walled the king in again. A ransom of staggering size finally bought his release, and part of the price was his own young daughter Ioveta, handed over as a hostage to the enemy. Read that plainly. The people Baldwin existed to protect had to empty their purses and surrender a royal child to buy their king back from a mountain prison. It stripped the illusion away for anyone watching. The head of this government could be lopped off at any hour by one ambush in a dry riverbed. When Baldwin II finally died in his own bed in August of 1131, worn to a thread, he took the habit of a monk in his last days at the patriarch's house near the sepulchre. He handed the kingdom a fresh version of the same crisis. 4 daughters, no son, the survival of the Holy Land now hung on finding a husband somewhere in Europe, a man rich enough, respected enough, and dangerous enough with a sword to be made king. The state had to import the man who would rule it. They chose Fulk of Anjou, a French count with deep lands and deeper coffers, grandfather of a boy in England who would one day be Henry II. He was past 40, balding, a widower, who left a grown son to rule Anjou behind him. He married Baldwin's eldest daughter, Melisande, and in September of 1131, the two were crowned together in the Holy Sepulchre. Watch the logic of the machine reveal itself here. The defense of Jerusalem had just been subcontracted to the marriage arithmetic of a house from the far side of the Mediterranean. Fulk could fight, but he was a stranger who spoke the wrong dialect and trusted his own Angevin retainers over the local lords, and the barons already rooted in the kingdom, families a generation deep in this soil, treated him as an intruder with a crown. They moved at once to fence him in. Our witness for this slow decay is the kingdom's own historian, William of Tyre. Remember the name, because he walks with us to the end. He was born in Jerusalem around 1130, sent to Europe for 20 years of schooling in Paris, Orléans, and Bologna, then returned to become Archbishop of Tyre, Chancellor of the realm, and tutor to a boy who would be king. He wrote his great chronicle in Latin from inside the palace, with the doors open to him and the secrets within reach. But he is not a neutral camera. He was a churchman who believed the kingdom's disasters were God's judgment on its sins, and he wrote to prove it. He loved the founding kings and distrusted the newcomers who came after. He also, we should note, wrote his history after most of these events, working from older chronicles and the memories of old men. rid him with all that in mind, and he is still the finest guide we have. William tells us the barons, wary of Fulk, gathered instead behind Queen Melisande, who had been raised in Jerusalem and was one of their own. The tension broke open in 1134, when a powerful baron named Hugh of Jaffa, the queen's own cousin, was accused of plotting against the king. Hugh appealed to arms, even allied briefly with the Muslim garrison of Ascalon, and was condemned. Then, days before his exile, an assassin's knife found him as he sat playing dice in the street on the Money Changers' Row in Jerusalem. He survived, barely, cut in several places. The killer, a Breton knight, confessed under torture that he had acted alone. Nobody in the city believed him. The finger pointed at the king. The mob nearly rose. Fulk was forced to make a public peace with his own queen to survive the scandal, and from then on, William writes, he grew so cautious he would not even name the officers of the household without her leave. Hear what that means. The king of Jerusalem was not a master of his kingdom. He was the largest shareholder in a company of armed lords, and any one of them might block him or send a blade after a rival on a public street when it served his own house. The crown was a prize you could win. It came trailing strings, and a dozen fists held the other ends. Fulk ruled this quarreling firm for 13 years, forever balancing the feuds inside the walls against the danger outside them. He strengthened the southern frontier against Egypt, throwing up the great fortresses of Beth Gibbelin, Ibelin, and Blanchegard in a ring around Muslim Ascalon, choking the port with stone. Then his end came, and it was a near-perfect image of the state he had governed. Not a glorious fall in battle, not a knife in a dark corridor, just an accident too small to matter that mattered completely. In November of 1143, the court rode out from Acre for a day of hunting in the coastal plain. The queen was with him. A hare broke from the scrub, and the king, a man past 50, spurred hard after it across the flat ground, shouting to his companions in the joy of the chase. The horse's hooves caught. Fulk was pitched forward over its neck, and the heavy wooden war saddle came down on his skull as he fell. William of Tyre records the injuries in the flat, clinical way a chancellor writes, and does not soften. Fulk never woke. He was carried back to Acre and lingered 3 days, his queen weeping at the bedside before he died. A stumble in a hunting field had beheaded the government as cleanly as any assassin. The kingdom passed into the hands of a widow in mourning and her 13-year-old boy. It is exactly in these gaps, these hollow places where power should be and briefly is not, that the enemy's view becomes the sharpest tool we have. The foes of Jerusalem were never one solid mass. They fought each other as bitterly as the Franks fought among themselves, Turk against Egyptian, Aleppo against Damascus, Emir against Emir. But in these years, one man was ending that. In Syria, the Turkish Atabeg Nur ad-Din was gathering the pieces with patience, binding Aleppo and Damascus under a single hand. He slept on a plain mat, wore undyed wool, banned wine and the drum and the flute from his camp, and had the word jihad preached from the pulpits of every city he took. He even commissioned a great carved wooden pulpit, a minbar, to be raised one day inside the mosque in Jerusalem he intended to retake. He was disciplined, devout, and gifted at war, and he carried a plan that reached decades ahead: drive the Franks into the sea. To a mind like that, a dead Crusader king was never a tragedy. It was a window. Fulk's ridiculous end in the hunting field was one more window opening, and within 2 years, Nur ad-Din's uncle had exploited the confusion to swallow the Crusader county of Edessa whole, the first of the 4 Latin states to fall, and the shock that would drag a second crusade east from Europe only to collapse in failure before the walls of Damascus. The largest window was still ahead. Fulk's son grew into Baldwin III, and by the reckoning of both sides, he was the best commander the kingdom had yet produced. He wrenched free of his mother's regency in a brief and bitter civil war in 1152, marching an army to besiege his own mother in the Tower of David until she yielded the crown to him alone. Then he proved himself worth the fight. In 1153, he took Ascalon, the last Egyptian foothold on the coast, after a siege that lasted through the winter and cost the life of the Templar Grand Master Bernard de Tremblay, who charged into a fresh breach at the head of 40 knights and was cut down inside the walls. His body hung from the battlements by the defenders the next morning. Baldwin's own knights trusted him. His enemies studied him. Then, in February of 1163, at only 33, campaigning near Tripoli, he fell sick and died fast. His bowels racked with a flux his physicians could not stop. His doctor, an Eastern Christian named Barak, was blamed for the pills he had prescribed. Poison was whispered up and down the coast. Nothing was ever proven. Muslims and Christians alike lined the roads as his body was carried the long way to Jerusalem, 8 days of mourning, and the chroniclers say even the Muslim raiding parties held back their arrows and let the funeral pass. The kingdom wept for a young king who had seemed like its future. This is a story about a political system built to crack, a kingdom always one funeral from tearing itself apart. Digging this out means going past the famous battles and down into the records themselves, the chronicles, the ransom accounts, the obituaries written by men with agendas of their own. That work costs time and it costs money. If you believe it matters, if you count yourself one of us, a real student of the past, with all its hard edges intact, then I invite you to join the lineage. It is our membership circle, the inner ring that keeps this channel breathing. Join it, and you stop being only a viewer. You become part of the crew that makes sure these stories get told with the depth they are owed. Early access to new investigations, exclusive perks, and beyond that, a hand in keeping the whole project alive. If you are one of us, take your place in the ranks. The link is in the description. When word of Baldwin III's death crossed into Syria, Nur ad-Din's emirs pressed him to strike immediately. The kingdom was in mourning. Its army was low and grieving. Its new king was the dead man's brother, Amalric, a stammering man of 30 who laughed too loudly and whose ability nobody yet trusted. This was the hour to attack, they told him. The enemy was open, leaderless, exposed on every side. His answer was written down, and it is one of the coldest lines in the whole chronicle. He refused. He told his commanders to hold. William of Tyre, writing from the Christian side of the line, preserved the reasoning of his enemy. We should spare their grief, Nur ad-Din is said to have told his men, for they have lost a prince, whose like the world does not now contain. It sounds like a knight's respect for a worthy rival. Strip the courtesy away, and something colder sits underneath. He was telling his emirs that the true strength of Jerusalem was never its walls or its knights. It was the skill of the man wearing the crown, and that man was in the ground. He did not need to march, he only needed to wait. The real enemy of the kingdom of Jerusalem was not camped outside its gates. It was inside the crown itself, in its mortality, in its broken succession, in a machine that ate its own kings faster than Europe could ship replacements. And as Amalric took the throne, the barons demanded a price for his crown. They forced him to set aside his own wife, Agnes of Courtenay, and declare his 2 children of doubtful legitimacy before they would let him rule. One of those children was a boy of about 3, a quiet, watchful child that the tutor William of Tyre would soon be handed to educate, and it was William who would be the first to notice, one ordinary afternoon, while the boys wrestled and pinched at play, that this one felt nothing at all in his right arm. The countdown shortens to 13 years. It is 1174. King Amalric is dead, and the manner of it fit nothing about the holiest throne in Christendom. No poison in a cup, no lance in the field, dysentery, the same squalid, wasting end that carried off the poorest pilgrim in the streets of Acre, took the king in his bed on the 11th of July, at 38, days after a failed march on Banias. The seat of Jerusalem passed to his son, a boy of 13. His name again was Baldwin, and for a season it looked as if the machine had spat out another gift. The boy was quick, well-made, and sat a horse better than men twice his age. His tutor was William of Tyre, the same chancellor who had already written the obituaries of every king before him, and William saw in the child the makings of a ruler worth the name. Then the tutor made a discovery that would decide the fate of the whole kingdom, and he made it not in a council chamber but in a courtyard at play. The scene William describes is small enough to have vanished from history, and it is the hinge on which everything turns. The young Baldwin was in the yard with the sons of the great barons, boys raised to be knights, testing each other the way such boys did. They dug their fingernails into one another's arms and held on, and the one who cried out first lost. William watched them drive their nails into the king's right arm. They twisted, they bore down until the skin broke. The boy did not flinch, he made no sound. The others praised his hardness, sure he was simply tougher than the rest of them. William saw something colder. He saw an absence where pain should be. He called the boy over and pressed the arm himself, thinking the child was acting out his pride. He was not acting. The boy said plainly that he felt nothing. A dead numbness had settled into the limb, from the hand to the elbow. William, one of the most learned men in the Latin East, knew the sign for what it was, and he wrote that he could scarcely hold back his tears. It was the first mark of a sickness the age counted as a living death, a state so feared that its victims were often given a funeral mass while still breathing and sent to live apart under the order of St. Lazarus, the leper knights who kept a house outside the northern wall of Jerusalem. The king of Jerusalem carried it in his own arm. The court tried to keep it quiet. William and the boy's physician searched for cures, ointments, bloodlettings, the baths at Tiberias, everything the medicine of the day could offer, and nothing touched it. For a time, the disease hid, giving the kingdom the illusion of an ordinary reign. But the numbness spread past the elbow, and there was no hiding what came next. Now the machine of state had to run with a dying child at the lever. The diagnosis was a sentence, but a slow one, and Baldwin IV refused to let it be a political one as well. What followed is the bravest and the most bitter chapter this short-lived kingdom ever wrote. As the disease began its patient work, the boy did not withdraw into a shuttered room. He did the reverse. He seized the whole burden of his office with the speed of a man who has been told how little time he owns. He came of age in 1176, dismissed his regent Raymond of Tripoli, and took the reins in his own hands. The illness moved through him without mercy. It started in the limbs. In time, it would reach the nerves of his face and slacken the flesh there. It would cloud, and then take his sight. It would curl and deaden his hands and feet until he could no longer close a fist on a sword hilt or grip a rein. And still he reigned. He held court in the palace beside the temple platform, where the Templars stabled their horses in the vaults below. He gave judgment, and he led armies into the field. The great adversary was already moving toward him. Nur ad-Din had died in Damascus in May of 1174, in the same season as Amalric, felled by a throat abscess as he prepared his own strike against the Franks, and his dream of a single Islamic front had passed to a sharper heir, a Kurdish officer from Tikrit named Zala al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The West would learn to call him Saladin. He had risen as a young lieutenant in Egypt, been made vizier there almost against his will, and after Nur ad-Din's death he moved fast, riding into Damascus in the autumn of 1174 to bind the dead man's lands to his own, while the dead man's young son was pushed aside. By 1177 he had locked Egypt and Syria into one hand, and the Crusader kingdom now sat inside a closing jaw, threatened from the south and the north at once. He was patient. He was methodical. He commanded numbers the Franks could not dream of matching, and he looked across the border at a realm governed by a 16-year-old leper and judged that the fruit was ripe. He marched his main army up out of Egypt that November, some 26,000 men by the chronicler's reckoning, driving for the heart of the kingdom, for Jerusalem itself, his columns spread out and raiding as they came, so sure of the outcome that discipline slackened across the coastal plain around Ramla and Lydda. Baldwin gathered what he could, around 500 knights, a few thousand foot. He rode down to Ascalon and found himself briefly penned inside its walls while Saladin's army rolled past toward the holy city. Then the king broke out. He carried with him the relic of the true cross, borne by the Bishop of Bethlehem in a jeweled reliquary, and men said afterward the sight of it steadied the line. He was already so weak that others had to lift him into the saddle. He led the charge himself. At Montgisard, near Ramla, on the 25th of November 1177, in the failing light of a late autumn afternoon, the small Frankish force smashed into Saladin's scattered column with a fury that had nothing to lose in it, and the larger host broke and ran across the muddy fields as a rainstorm came down and swelled the streams. The Templars, riding in a tight wedge under Odo de Saint-Amand, tore through the Sultan's bodyguard. Saladin got away by the width of a hair, fleeing across the Sinai on a fast racing camel, so short of water that many of his men died on the sands going home, and Bedouin picked off the stragglers. The leper boy had saved his kingdom in an afternoon, and he was 16. Look at that day from the far side of the hill, and it reads like a wound the enemy could not stop touching. Saladin's own chroniclers, Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad and Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, wrote these campaigns from within his camp, and their pages carry something close to unease. They were fighting a state commanded by a rotting child who would not break. Imad al-Din owned Montgisard as a disaster that shamed the army and cost the Sultan dear, and Saladin himself, they say, spoke of it afterward with a grief he did not hide, having lost the bulk of the men he led out of Egypt. In the years that followed, Saladin came back again and again, probing, raiding, besieging, and again the king appeared at the head of his men to check him. When Baldwin could no longer hold a rein, he had himself carried to the front on a litter, a moving throne of poles and cloth slung between two horses, from which he read the battle and gave his orders. His face was wrapped now to hide what the sickness had done to it. His hands were bound in linen, His body was failing beneath the silk, but the sight of that litter coming up through the dust, that plain image of a will that refused to lie down, was itself a weapon. In 1182, at the ford over the Jordan below the great castle of Belvoir, and again in the campaigns around the springs of Safuria, Saladin's far larger armies watched the king's approach and drew off rather than close, unsettled by the thing they were looking at. The Sultan was playing a long war of grinding attrition, patient enough to outlast a healthy man, and a boy who knew he was the last wall between his people and the end kept knocking the board over. There were failures, too, and they marked him. In June of 1179 at Marj Ayoun, near the headwaters of the Jordan, the young king was caught in the open, his army scattered in a rout, and he escaped only because a knight lifted the crippled king bodily onto a horse and carried him from the field, while others died to buy the time. That same year, Saladin razed the half-built castle at Jacob's Ford, Chastelet, that Baldwin had raised to guard the river crossing, undermining the walls and firing the timbers, and the Templars who held it were cut down or led away in chains to Damascus. The war had a rhythm of blow and counterblow, and the Leper king absorbed every reverse and rose again. But each rising cost him more of the body he had left, and the physicians who unwound his bandages saw less of him each season. One man made the war worse from inside the kingdom. Reynald of Chatillon, lord of the desert fortress of Kerak beyond the Jordan, kept breaking the truces the king struggled to hold. He raided the caravans and the pilgrim roads to Mecca, launched a fleet of ships hauled overland, and floated on the Red Sea to strike at the coast of Arabia and threaten the holy cities themselves, and gave Saladin the one thing a holy war needs, an enemy who could be painted as a defiler. The king, too weak to rein him in, watched his own vassal hand the Sultan his cause. In 1183, Saladin came in person to besiege Kerak, and did it during the wedding feast of a young couple within the castle. The story runs that the bride's mother sent dishes from the marriage banquet out to Saladin's tent, and the Sultan, honoring the courtesy, ordered his engineers to leave the newlyweds' tower untouched while his stones battered the rest. Reynald would matter to the very end, but that reckoning belongs further down the clock. Courage is not a form of government. While the king held the enemy out beyond the frontier, the rot inside the walls sped up, outrunning even the leprosy in his blood. The court of Jerusalem was not lifted up by his sacrifice. It was quickened by the certainty of his death. The great lords were not laying plans for the kingdom's survival. They were laying plans for the hour the throne came open. Factions hardened around the king's two sisters, Sibylla and Isabella, and every powerful man in the realm was weighing sides, cutting deals, betting on which woman's marriage would carry the crown. Old settlers, the Poulains born in the East who knew how to live beside their Muslim neighbors, lined up against newcomers fresh off the ships from France, who wanted lands and titles of their own and preached open war. And into that court walked the most ruinous figure in the whole story, a good-looking, easy-mannered, and hollow French lord named Guy of Lusignan. Guy came east as a landless adventurer with a killing behind him in France, said to have ambushed the Earl of Salisbury on a road in Poitou, and through a fast and clever piece of court maneuvering, he married the king's elder sister, Sibylla, at Easter in 1180. It was rushed through in days, partly to block a rival faction that meant to marry her to another lord entirely, and seize the succession that way. Baldwin was appalled. He knew Guy. He had watched him in council and in the field. He judged him ambitious past his ability, proud past his sense, and empty of any real gift for war or rule. But the marriage stood, and through his wife Guy was now a claimant to the throne. The king, going blind and often confined to his bed, was pressed to name a regent to govern in his stead, and with no other grown male kinsman to hand, he was cornered into naming Guy in 1183. It went exactly as he feared, given the kingdom's army that autumn to turn back yet another of Saladin's invasions. Guy froze. He mustered the largest Frankish host raised in years, some 1,300 knights and 15,000 foot, sat with them at the springs of Saphuria, where the water ran cool and plentiful, and refused every call to attack. He let Saladin march about the Vale of Jezreel, burn the countryside around Nazareth, sack the pilgrim church at the springs of Ain Jalut, and withdraw untouched across the Jordan. The barons watched their commander do nothing while the smoke rose over the farms, and many of them wanted to fight, and still nothing came. The humiliation was public and total, and it split the army into open hatred of the man leading it. Baldwin, blind now and dying, dragged himself upright one more time. He had himself carried before the assembly at Jerusalem, stripped Guy of the regency to his face, and moved to have Sibylla's marriage dissolved. He tried to cut the tumor out of the living body of the state. When Guy shut himself up in Ascalon and Jaffa and refused to open the gates to his own king, Baldwin had himself carried to the walls of Ascalon to demand entry, and Guy left the gates barred against him. The insult was open now, a vassal refusing his dying king. But the factions had grown past the king. The lords, who had staked their fortunes on Guy, blocked him at every corner. He was trying to bring a ship into harbor through a gale, while his own crew worked below the waterline, boring holes in the hull. His last years became a race he already knew he would lose. Understanding how little was left to him, Baldwin made his final move as king. He had Sibylla's small son from her first marriage to William of Montferrat, a boy of 5, crowned as co-king in November of 1183 in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, carried to the altar on the shoulders of the great Lord Baldwin of Ibelin, because the child was too small to walk the procession himself, while the Leper king watched from his litter, so the succession would leap clean over Guy entirely. Then he built a formal structure to govern after his own death. He named the ablest lord in the kingdom, Raymond, Count of Tripoli, as regent for the child, and bound the arrangement with an oath sworn by the barons, and set out a plan by which, if the boy died young, the kings of England and France and the Pope himself would judge between the two sisters for the crown. He even entrusted the keys of the royal treasure and the citadel to the masters of the temple and the hospital, so that no single faction could seize them. It was the best a dying man could raise, a firewall against the greed of his own blood. But he knew the men he was building it against. He had held the whole realm upright for a decade on nothing but the pressure of his own character, and he knew that the moment that pressure lifted, the wall would go with it. The record that lets us stand this close to the collapse is remarkable, and it rests above all on one book. William of Tyre's history, an eyewitness chronicle written from inside the Crusader court by the man who was tutor, chancellor, and archbishop all at once, carried down to us and continued by later hands, after his own account breaks off around this very year. It is the foundation stone under everything you are hearing. That great archive of a kingdom eating itself is on the shop shelf below this video right now. If you want to hold the full weight of this story, to read the sentences of the man who watched it happen with his own eyes, this is the text to own. It was the primary source for this script, and while you are there, look through the rest of what we have gathered, a curated set of relics and dark memorabilia tied to this lost Crusader realm. Open the shelf on your screen with the View Products button and browse those pieces while the story runs on. The end for the Leper King came in the spring of 1185. He was 24. For nearly half the life he had been given, the sickness had unmade his body a little more each year, taking first the feeling in his arm, then his other limbs, then his sight, until in his last months he lay blind and unable to move, and men had to feed him and carry him from room to room in the palace above the temple. For the whole of his adult life he had carried a kingdom on shoulders that were coming apart beneath the load. He had stared down the finest general the age produced and held him to a draw across the sand. What he could not defeat lived inside his own gates and inside his own family. Now the one man who had bound the realm together with his own will was gone, laid to rest among the kings of Jerusalem at the foot of Golgotha, and every careful arrangement he had raised to guard the future was about to be pulled down by smaller men for smaller reasons. The clock had stopped counting in years. It was counting in months now, and the child king he had crowned to save the succession, the little boy carried to the altar on a great lord's shoulders, had less time left than anyone in that court dared to say aloud. The countdown is down to its final 13 months. The firewall the dying Leper King built to shield his kingdom held for less than a year. His heir was the child Baldwin V, a sickly boy who had never been strong, so frail that he had been crowned while his uncle still lived, just to fix the succession in place. In the late summer of 1186, at 8 or 9 years old, he died at Acre, and the careful line his uncle had drawn collapsed with him. The regent, Raymond of Tripoli, moved to hold the realm together the lawful way. He called for a council of the great barons and the masters of the temple and the hospital to weigh the future of the crown, exactly as the Leper King had ordered on his deathbed. He was too slow. The boy's mother had waited her whole life for this hour, and she did not wait for a council. Sibylla struck with speed and cold precision. She and her faction seized the coastal cities first, Acre and Beirut, the ports and the money that flowed through them, and then they rode hard for Jerusalem up through the Judean hills. They came in through the gates and barred them shut behind them, locking the regent and half the nobility of the kingdom outside the walls. The great lords who had sworn to judge the succession fairly stood on the wrong side of a bolted gate. Raymond withdrew to Tiberias in fury, and some of the barons rode north to his side and began to speak of raising Sibylla's half-sister Isabella and her husband as rival monarchs. The kingdom was splitting into 2 courts before it had even finished burying its child king, but the throne was already inside the holy city, and it was hers. What happened next was a piece of stagecraft that doubled as a seizure of power. In the church of the Holy Sepulchre, on the floor above the rock of Calvary, under the dome where pilgrims wept at the empty tomb, Sibylla was crowned Queen of Jerusalem. The patriarch Heraclius, a man whose own reputation was stained by rumor and greed, performed the rite and told her that a woman needed a man to govern beside her. He set a second crown in her hands to give to whichever lord she chose. Her enemies, penned outside the walls, had gambled everything on one belief. They were sure the court would force her to cast off her useless husband, Guy of Lusignan, as the price of her own reign. Some accounts say she had even hinted she might do it. They had read her wrongly to the last inch. Sibylla took up the second crown. She called Guy forward before the whole assembly. She lifted the crown from her own head, placed it on his, and said aloud that she chose as king the man she had chosen as husband. Then she set the second crown back upon herself. 2 crowns, 1 act. She was queen by the blood in her veins, and he was king by nothing but her will. The one man, Baldwin IV, had spent his dying years straining to keep off that throne, now wore it in the holiest church in the world. Away in Tiberias, Raymond of Tripoli heard the news, and, the chroniclers say, made a truce of his own with Saladin to protect his lands, letting Muslim troops cross his territory. The kingdom had its king at last, chosen at the worst possible hour, and it had a leading baron who had all but left the fold. The bait for the trap was already being set by a man the Leper king had never been able to control. Reynald of Chatillon, lord of the desert stronghold of Kerak beyond the Jordan, was a plunderer who broke sworn truces for profit and for the pleasure of it. Years before, he had raided down onto the Red Sea, with ships hauled overland in pieces, threatening the sea road to Mecca itself, a thing no Frankish lord had ever dared. In the winter of 1186, he fell on a rich caravan crossing from Cairo toward Damascus under the protection of a standing peace. He stripped it of everything, its silks and its coin and its beasts, and threw its people into his dungeons under the black basalt of Kerak. When they reminded him of the truce, he is said to have sneered that they should call on their Muhammad to save them. Saladin was not merely angered. This was a personal wound, and the shattering of an oath sworn before God. And it is said his own sister may have been traveling with that caravan. He demanded the captives freed and the goods restored. Reynald refused him to his face. As king, Guy held the lawful power to compel his vassal to obey. He used none of it. Saladin swore then, before his emirs, that he would take Reynald's life with his own hand. In the summer of 1187, the Sultan crossed the frontier with the largest army he had ever gathered against the Franks, drawing contingents from Egypt, Syria, and the lands of the Jazira, and he laid his trap with care. He besieged Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, a town belonging to Raymond of Tripoli, the very lord who had counseled peace at every turn. Raymond's own wife, Ashiva, was shut inside its lakeside citadel and sent word begging for rescue. It was a hook baited with a friend's family, and it was meant for the new king. Guy swallowed it whole in the war council at the springs of Saphuria, where the water ran cool through the meadows, and the whole field army of the kingdom lay encamped in good order. Raymond himself argued against the march. He knew the ground better than any man there. He told the assembly to let Tiberias fall, even with his own wife inside it, because a town could be retaken, but the army could not be remade, and the barren road to the lake had no water for such a host. The older barons, the men born in the east, agreed with him, and for a night the council chose to hold. Then, after dark, Reynald of Chatillon and the master of the temple, Gerard de Riedfort, came to the king's tent and worked on him alone. Gerard nursed an old hatred for Raymond, who had once married the woman he wanted to another man, and he burned to fight. He told Guy that Raymond was a traitor in secret league with the Muslims, that a king who cowered at Saphuria while a city fell would be despised by every knight in the camp. By morning, the king had reversed the whole council. To march the entire host across the parched hills of Galilee in the heat of July, away from the good springs, was not a bold stroke. It was self-destruction. The army, perhaps 1,200 knights and near 15,000 foot, was the one thing the kingdom could not replace and could not spare, drawn to its fullness only because the king had emptied the treasure left by King Henry II of England, held in deposit at the temple to hire mercenaries. On the morning of the 3rd of July, 1187, Guy gave the order to move, and the columns wound out into the dry country under a white sky. The true cross carried at their heart by the Bishop of Acre in place of the sick patriarch. There was no water on the line of march. The Muslim horse archers harried the flanks from the first hour, wheeling in, loosing and darting away, so that the Crusaders could not close with them and could not rest. By midday, men and horses were failing in the heat. Raymond, leading the vanguard who knew the country, begged the king to push on to the springs at Hattin, but the rear under the Templars was so pressed that the army halted short on a waterless plateau below two low volcanic hills the local people called the Horns of Hattin. Through the night, the Franks lay in their mail on the bare rise, ringed by Saladin's troops, who held the road to the lake and every drop of its water behind them. They could see the Sea of Galilee glittering below in the dark, close enough to torment them, and could not reach it. The enemy's fires burned in a great arc, and the chanting of thousands of voices carried up the slope through the night with the drums and the cymbals. Saladin's men had brought up camels loaded with water-skins and clay jars filled from the lake, and set them in plain sight of the dying army. Some, the chroniclers say, they emptied onto the stones where the Christians could watch the water vanish into the dust. At first light, on the 4th of July, the Sultan's men set fire to the dry thorn and grass across the slope, and the wind rolled the smoke uphill into faces that had not drunk in a day and a night. Then the cavalry came in through the haze and the burning brush. What the records call the Battle of the Horns of Hattin was not a battle in any ordinary sense. It was the methodical dismantling of an army that could barely stand. The foot soldiers, maddened by thirst, broke away and crowded onto the higher of the two hills, and would not come down to fight, and no order could move them. The knights formed and charged again, Raymond in one furious wedge that broke clean through the Muslim line to his front, which simply opened and let him ride out and away, unable to turn back. Around the king, the last knights fought on around the true cross and the red tent that had been raised as a rallying point. By the afternoon, the tent had fallen. The relic of the true cross was taken. Guy and the surviving lords were dragged down as prisoners. The field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was destroyed in a single day, and no wall in the land had men enough left to defend it. The verdict on the whole broken machine was delivered not on the burning hill, but hours later, in the shade of Saladin's command tent pitched near Tiberias, and his own secretaries, Imad al-Din among them, wrote down every word. The captive leaders were brought before him, King Guy at their head, faint with thirst and heat, his brother Amalric beside him, and among them Reynald of Chatillon and Gerard de Riedfort. Saladin treated the king with courtesy, seating him and, seeing the man half dead, offering a cup of iced water, sweetened with rose water, cooled with snow brought down from Mount Hermon. Guy drank deeply and passed the cup to Reynald. Every man in that tent understood the weight of the gesture. By the old law of the desert, to give a man drink was to grant him your protection. Saladin spoke at once to his interpreter, and his voice was cold. "Tell the king," he said, "that it was he who gave that man the water, not I." The Sultan owed Reynald no safety. He turned to the prisoner and set out the crimes, the shattered truces, the plundered caravan, the raid toward the holy cities of Islam. He offered Reynald his life in exchange for accepting Islam. Reynald refused it with contempt. Saladin rose, drew his own blade, and struck him down, and his guards finished it and dragged the body out of the tent by the heels. Guy sat shaking, certain his turn had come. Saladin had him reassured with his own mouth. "It is not the custom of kings," he said, "to kill kings." Guy was a foolish monarch, and would be kept and ransomed as one. Reynald had been a brigand, and had at last been paid a brigand's wage. 2 days later, at the Sultan's order, the captured Templars and Hospitallers, the sworn warrior monks, whom Saladin judged too dangerous ever to release, were separated from the common prisoners and put to death, while Gerard de Riedfort, their own Grand Master, was spared for his rank and later ransomed. After that, the collapse ran downhill without a break. There was no army left in the field, and the walled towns had no one to hold them. They fell one after another through the late summer. Acre first, with its harbor and its warehouses, then Nazareth, Sidon, Beirut, Jebel, Ramla, Caesarea, most opening their gates the moment Saladin's banners appeared, because there were no garrisons to say no. Ascalon held out a little and was taken. Only Tyre, on its narrow spit of rock, held firm, saved by the sudden arrival by sea of Conrad of Montferrat, who barred its harbor with a chain and threw back every assault. Baldwin of Ibelin, the lord who had once carried the child Baldwin V to his crowning on his own shoulders, was given a safe conduct into Jerusalem to bring his wife out, found the holy city swollen with refugees and defended by almost no knights, and was begged by the people to stay and lead them. He broke his word to Saladin with the Sultan's leave and took command. He knighted every boy of noble blood, over 16 and 30 burghers besides, to make numbers that could not hold the walls. When the siege came and the northern wall was undermined, Balian rode out to Saladin and threatened to burn the city, destroy the dome of the rock, and kill every Muslim prisoner inside rather than let it be stormed. Saladin, who wanted the city whole and holy, agreed to terms. On the 2nd of October, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered, and its Christians were allowed to buy their freedom at a set price and walk out in long columns toward the coast. Those who could not pay the ransom were led into slavery. The city that 3 generations of Crusaders had died to take and to keep passed out of Latin hands after 88 years. The crown of Jerusalem was now a title with no kingdom beneath it. The story should have ended on that church floor. Instead, the title lived on, and its afterlife reads like a grim echo of everything that came before. Guy, ransomed, proved so hollow a king that the barons of the Rump Kingdom soon looked past him to Conrad of Montferrat, the defender of Tyre, and chose Conrad king in his place. Days after the crown was promised to him, in April of 1192, Conrad was walking home through the streets of Tyre when 2 men dressed as monks, sent by the sect the Franks called the Assassins, cut him down. His widow Isabella was married within a week to Henry of Champagne, who took the title next. Henry ruled from Acre until 1197, when he fell to his death from a high window of his palace there, some said reaching for the sill after stepping back to greet an envoy. The title passed again to Guy's own brother, Amalric of Lusignan, who died in 1205 after eating a surfeit of white mullet at table. The crown had become precisely what the leper king had feared, a thing that unmade the men who reached for it, by knife, by fall, by fish. The last debasement of the title happened far from any battlefield in the Levant. Through a chain of dynastic marriages, the claim to Jerusalem drifted north into the Hohenstaufen line, the imperial house of Germany. The Emperor Frederick II wore it, and even walked into a Jerusalem briefly restored to him by treaty in 1229, crowning himself in the Holy Sepulchre while the local clergy, hating him, laid the whole city under interdict around him. By the middle of the 13th century, the king of Jerusalem was Frederick's grandson, a German boy named Conradin, who never once set eyes on the Levant. His kingdom existed only on parchment in a German chancery. At 16, he led an army south over the Alps into Italy to claim his family's inheritance there, was beaten at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, and was taken and tried as a usurper by his rival, Charles of Anjou, who had taken Naples and Sicily for himself. On the 29th of October, 1268, in the market square of Naples by the sea, before a silent crowd, Conradin, the last direct heir of the line that ran back to Godfrey of Bouillon and to Baldwin the Leper, was beheaded on a scaffold. He was said to have thrown his glove into the crowd as a last summons to vengeance. The title King of Jerusalem did not end in a holy war. It ended with a teenager killed over a quarrel about Italian land. And there is one last erasure. For nearly 7 centuries, the stone tombs of the first kings of Jerusalem lay where they had been laid, at the foot of Calvary in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Plain, unadorned sarcophagi bearing carved Latin verses holding Godfrey, who had refused the crown, and Baldwin I, who had been carried home salted across the desert, and Fulk of Anjou thrown by his horse, and Baldwin III, and the rest of the early rulers, laid in a row near the spot where the cross had stood. They had outlasted the fall of the city in 1187. Saladin had let them lie undisturbed. They survived Mamluk rule and Ottoman rule, the last solid link between the living present and the founding of the state. Then, in 1808, fire tore through the church in the night and gutted the rotunda and the chapel where the tomb stood, cracking the stone in the heat. In the long rebuilding that followed, under the Greek Orthodox clergy who held that part of the church, the tombs were judged unsightly clutter, an unwanted trace of a Latin Catholic monarchy in a sanctuary that was now theirs. They were broken apart and carried off as rubble. The last physical remnant of the kings was destroyed not by any enemy of the faith, but in the course of a renovation, by fellow Christians clearing a floor. Nothing is left. No crown, no dynasty, not even a grave to stand over. The state raised to guard the holiest city on earth ends as a set of empty places on a church floor, its memory scraped down to the ghosts of its own failures. It was a kingdom that could never escape the logic written into it at its birth, when one pious man refused a crown of gold and left no clear way to pass on power. It was a crown built to devour whoever wore it, passing through leprosy and hunting accidents, and salted corpses and assassins in monks' robes, and a surfeit of fish, and a scaffold in a foreign market square, in an unbroken chain. And it was so completely erased in the end that we can only rebuild it now from the chronicles of the men who defeated it, from the sober record of William of Tyre, and from the silent witness of its ruins. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its final empty grave. If it moved you, or made you see this kingdom differently than the legend of one lost battle ever let you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand how a state can die from the inside long before its last army marches out. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another investigation is opening on your screen right now, the next thread waiting to be pulled. Click it and walk on into the past with us